should just speak. Just speak.
Okay. Thank you, Johan. I would like to talk about the challenge that we in Ghana face with these climate funds. It's important to know two particular challenges that we face in terms of the finances. For instance, the first one of them is the huge gap, financing gap. Yes. On record, the African Development Bank says that Africa needs between 20 to 30 billion dollars. That is annually for the next 10 to 20 years. We in Ghana, we also need $463 million annually for that same 10 to 20 year period to be able to finance our adaptations.
That's for adaptation, no?
Yes, that's for adaptations. And looking at our budgetary constraints that we have, that becomes a huge challenge to us. Also, the funds that are even available are very unpredictable to the extent that it becomes sometimes difficult in planning because you don't know when these funds are going to be released for you to work with. Then we have the funds also being so fragmented. That is various funds to the extent that it becomes difficult sometimes to know the requirements of each and every one of them. And it's also difficult for you because they all come with different responsibilities and requirements for proposal formulation. So what happens is that you have to be able to write several different proposals for each and every one of them. We would want these fragmented donor banks to be at least a few institutions. If all funding can be brought together so that just a few of them will be handling them. And these few must be the ones with the proven track record. For instance, SIF, that we've been working fantastically with in Ghana. So these are my major problems.
Interesting, thank you. The issue of predictability, I know, was also discussed in an earlier session today. Fragmentation comes up also. I mean, even I guess almost a controversial proposal to try to get these funds together in to smaller numbers, actors together. There's a risk of fragmentation. Very interesting. Thank you very much. Ambassador Luis Alfonso de Alba, I know you have a very interesting task right now. You are the UN Special Envoy for the 2019 Climate Summit that Secretary General Guterres has been calling for. Can you tell us a little bit about this and how you then will address the challenges maybe related to the architecture there? And if you see, of course, from your experience, if you see any other points that you would like to make in this particular question.
Thank you very much, Johan. Well, let me start by saying that the summit in September 23rd should serve to precisely to fine-tune and identify some of the problems that we are confronting. And I will start with making sure that the 100 billion that have been promised would be delivered. I think that's something which is a fundamental first step. We may move from the billions to the trillions, but not before complying with the commitments that developed countries have made since Copenhagen, Cancun, and certainly they were sealed in the Paris Agreement. And we need also to do it in a balanced way. And I mean balance, especially between money that has been put for adaptation vis-a-vis mitigation, because that has been also part of the agreements since Cancun, that we will devote, and Copenhagen, that we will devote 50% of the resources to adaptation. And it's quite important for developing countries, which happens to be frequently the victims of climate change rather than the ones that cause that problem. The second challenge, I think, it is to make sure that we can reach to additional private funding, and we can make the case that it is in their own interest in the longer term. And the governments need to make sure that they take the risk so that the private money will start flowing, and then we will move on to a larger scale. But before going to the larger scale and still talking about what is needed, and I feel that that's particularly the case for Africa, but it's also for the Caribbean, for instance, in my own region, coming from Mexico. There is an additional problem, which I would like to highlight here, which is the access to those resources. At least in the Caribbean, and it has been my personal experience working with some of the CARICOM members, there is a lot of difficulty to put together a proposal that could make it to the GCF or to the World Bank. Direct access has not been always very easy. Assistance for the preparation of projects is quite important. In the Caribbean, they recently launched an initiative together with some countries, Mexico, Canada, others, and private sector, that they call it the Adaptation Accelerator, if I'm not wrong, which is a good example. So we need the money first, then access to that money, which is quite important, and finally, we need a scale up the resources with the private sector. Let me just make one last point on the summit itself. To do this, we have the Secretary General of the UN has asked two governments to lead, the governments of France and the government of Jamaica. And it has asked also the World Bank to support that effort. And we are going to try to build a coalition through this process by which we will be able to identify solutions for different levels of development, different regions. And I would like to use this occasion to invite all of you to get to the French, to the Jamaican, or through the World Bank involved. The objective of the summit is not to have a long list of proposals or suggestions, but to be very specific. Bold, action-oriented proposals are going to be the only ones that will make it to the summit, because we want that to have a transformational impact, not just a Christmas tree general debate as normally happens at the UN. This time, the UN will try to do differently.
Thank you, and you're raising our expectations clearly here. It's interesting you say this access issue, it's complicated. Countries actually need support to put together even the proposals. It could be a question, maybe it can come back a little bit later, if you can also simplify the processes and the systems, because they are, as you say, indeed very complicated for many countries. Maybe someone who has some experience, practical experience working on this matter, Mr. Paddy Padmanathan, President and CEO of ACWA Power. I listened to you also earlier in one of the sessions here on solar, and you mentioned it is complicated, complex to work with all these different actors. So where do you see these main challenges? We will talk about the future also later on, but where do you see the challenge? What's your experience there?
Thank you. So yeah, the thing that the word that springs to mind is that tenacity, but then I think the level of patience and perseverance required. We need to find a new word actually. Too many funds, too many instruments, too complex, painfully slow, and yet we all recognize scale and speed is what is required, right? What is frustrating from us, on the private sector side, is that having structured $40+ billion of project financing in the last 12 years, there's a lot of money that is available, and it is not just for countries like United Arab Emirates. It is for the developing world. We are working in the developing world. So it is possible, it's doable, but the climate finance architecture is way too complex for us to be able to get it done at the speed with which we want. Okay, having said that, we have done it. So when something works, like CTF, it's frustrating to see that people go off and invent new structures, and then we have got to go back and spend a lot of time registering ourselves through those new processes. It takes, well, we are working on GCF for 2 years now, and we haven't quite got there yet. Almost got there, I'm told. So I think when something is working, there is a logic in crowding in behind that and build on the experience and work with it. But one of the other challenges that we have with public sector financing when it comes in, it follows the traditional rules. Over the years, public sector financing has been provided on a G2G basis or multilateral to a G basis. So the terms and conditions are of a very different sort of nature to what is needed in order to reduce the cost of financing and deliver the project. Reducing the cost of financing is not just about reducing the interest rate, by the way, or the tenor. It's about a whole package of, and the best example I can give you, I see that Mustafa Bukhari is gone, but he knows it very well. Noor Complex, fantastic success. We reduced the cost of CSP. In reality, we could have reduced the cost by at least 6%, just like that off the top of our head, if a couple of very small terms and conditions had changed. In essence, that project is being funded almost like a corporate finance for 6 years because of the level of guarantees that are required, and then it flips effectively into a project finance. If we take out from day one a conventional project finance framework, and there is no earthly reason, Morocco, there was no issue with multilaterals lending into Morocco. There is no issue about them being comfortable with the technology. Today, we are raising pure public finance, private finance for very large CSP projects. So multilaterals lending in should not be a problem, right? But yet, because of that sort of traditional mindset, they end up putting so many guarantee requirements that just simply adds cost. So take an $800 million project, just one of these projects, they're typically 600 to 800 million, take one 800 million, the 40% extra level of guarantees required for that first 6 years very coolly adds, so $320 million worth of guarantees, 1.5% guarantee cost. Very quickly, you add $30 million extra to the project cost.
Yeah.
That's 5% extra cost. If that was not there, the tariff would have been down by 6%. So we need to start thinking about also the terms and conditions, recognizing that they need to become, they also need to help reduce the cost.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting. I mean, somehow, somewhere, there is probably a discussion about risk aversion and so on surrounding this. But just also quickly, I mean, you have the experience of many projects, large projects. Yeah. My question, if you can answer it very briefly, so you have been successful in a large project, the whole process. Why can't you just then copy that more or less? It seems like you have to restart every time. Every project sort of has to run through the same process and all these barriers and so on.
Well, that's because of the way that architecture is defined, right?
Okay.
That's what is stopping it being replicated. All these are replicable. Again, we also sit back and are frustrated to see why is it that we have to go back and go through all those negotiations again. And the other thing is this complexity also limits the number of players who can participate.
Yes.
If only we can get more private sector actors to participate as well. If they can, if the complexity can be reduced, you will get more participants.
More actors on board. Kate Hughes, Director for International Climate and Energy, UK Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. Welcome back to the panel here as well. What are your reflections when you hear all this? I mean, you come from a government, you are one of the funders of the systems, of course, and I'm sure that you also, set certain requirements on the system. So what are your reflections? Where do you see the barriers today before we talk about the future?
Good question. And yes, the UK government is a large contributor to the climate finance architecture. I mean, what a phrase that is. I mean, we're the largest donor to the climate investment funds, which we're very proud of, and we contribute a huge amount of our climate finance to some of these large funds. And so I guess, yes, we are also part of the problem as much as the solution, and that doesn't mean that we don't want to also change it from where we're sitting. And we see great opportunities within the architecture. But I mean, I'm just going to pause and just say, just even the term architecture is something which, when I first started working in this field, I thought, what on earth are they talking about? And you sit in these meetings and people talk about modalities and operationalizing, different kinds of architectural, processes, and you think, what's going on here? Because what's actually important about this is the architecture isn't the end, it's the means to the ends. And so it needs to be fit for purpose. The architecture needs to deliver what you want it to deliver, and it needs to be fit for purpose, and it needs to be locally appropriate, and it needs to be resilient, and it needs to adapt over time and to be flexible. But I think sometimes we get a little bit too hung up on the actual architecture and forget about what's actually important and what are we actually trying to deliver. Or assume that there's just one architecture. We're sitting in a fabulous building here and it's great for a conference hall, but I wouldn't want this to be my bathroom. So there are different kinds of architecture for different kinds of things. And, through with the UK and all of you out there, you will, we all kind of use different kinds of finance in different ways. We have bilateral programs, I have multilateral programs, I have multi-buy programs, and I have buy-multi programs. What on earth that means, you can ask me over a drink tonight. Are we talking about, is the architecture about just the UK climate finance? Is it about the 100 billion? Is it about the individual funds, the CIFs, the GCF, the other components of this architecture? Or is it actually about the $90 trillion, whatever figure we know that is needed to be mobilized over the next 15 years to actually affect the change that we need? That's a long way round of saying we need to see changes to the architecture, of course we do. We can't just sort of stick it in time and hope that it will work. The MDBs were created in a time and they need to adapt and change. 10 years ago when the CIFs were created, there wasn't any Airbnb. There wasn't any Paris Agreement. There wasn't any Brexit. All of these things change for better or for worse, and we need to adapt to them. And is the architecture complicated? Yes, it is complicated, but actually the challenges are complicated, aren't they, too? I mean, the CIFs alone, we've got 4 funds within the CIFs, and they are targeted to different kinds of problems in different kinds of geographies and different kinds of finance to try and achieve different kinds of solutions. I'm not saying we can't simplify it, and I think that's absolutely appropriate. And the barriers to change are complex. If we're trying to leverage more capital, if we're trying to do capacity building in countries, if we're trying to overcome risk, if we're trying to leverage private finance, and if actually ultimately we're trying to make all of that normal, not just something which the climate finance architecture does, but that everyone does as a matter of course, then maybe we need some complex mechanisms. Now I'm going to struggle with my own words, having kind of pulled them apart. The other thing which I just wanted to sort of put out there, which again might feel controversial, but why not? It's the end of the day, is that sometimes we talk about climate finance as if somehow it's different. It should have different rules, but it's still finance. We still need to ask the right questions about it. In fact, we probably need to ask more questions. It's a very precious commodity, and we shouldn't be throwing it away carelessly. I'm not saying that we are, but I think we absolutely, what the benefits of the architecture gives us is a framework in which we can make sure that we are maximising the impact of what it does. We're not just funding something that could be done anyway, say with the private sector. We are using our concessional finance, the collaborative effort of these funds to achieve something which would not happen anyway. There used to be a brilliant beer advert in the UK about how this beer would reach the parts that other beers couldn't reach. What we want to do with our finance is use our finance through these funds to reach the parts that finance isn't yet reaching. It needs to be additional. It needs to be transformational, following that conversation that we had this morning. So the architecture provides the foundations. Maybe it provides some viewing platforms so we can look around and see what we've learned, what worked, what didn't work, and we can work together. It provides some opportunities for us to come together and provide that collaboration, which I think is critical. But I think there is a big question out here about the future and how do we shake this up? Just because it's worked for a few years, or maybe it's worked just about all right, doesn't mean we need to continue in that way. So it needs to constantly adapt and evolve as well.
And that's, of course, the question we'll come back to later on. It's interesting. I think many of us now will remember something about the global climate architecture being the same as a British beer ad. And probably when we're going to try to retell this story in about a week, we're going to mess it up somehow. But a lot of interesting points there, really, I must say. Amal-Lee, Amin, you know, it's tough for you to be now the last one on the panel, because in this first round we were talking about the challenges and the fact that, you know, it's difficult and it's complex and difficult to access and it's fragmented and so on. And now you are representing that architecture here. So you are the Chief Climate Change and Sustainability Division at the Inter-American Development Bank. You know, what is your reaction now to these comments, and where do you see challenges at being inside one of these banks?
So maybe before I focus on the future, I will go back a little bit. Back actually 11 years, I actually was in the UK government that designed these funds initially when they were launched. And basically it was a huge experiment. I mean, we put out transformational. I remember having a lot of debate. I was in the Environment Ministry, we were working with DFID, and I was like, well, what do we mean by transformational? Like, we don't know, but let's just give it a go. Let's set an ambitious high bar for the multilateral development banks, recognizing that they have a lot of expertise, they have a lot of finance, and all of that needs to be shifted to the low carbon and resilient economy. And so let's set a high bar, transformational, scale, pace. I think one thing that's important to recognize about the CIFs, it really has minimized the amount of architecture that has had to be created. It builds on and it utilizes the existing architecture of the multilateral development banks. The CIF admin unit, I mean, how many, did we hear, what, a couple of thousand people? No, it was, I mean, how many people in the CIF admin units? 35 people. But how many people in all the MDBs that are also part of the admin unit, extended family? The MDB, we have an MDB committee. So over the last 10 years, the CIFs have evolved with the input of MDBs, expertise, coming into the design both of new programs, so the PPCR, which was very much a joint MDB effort, the Forest Investment Programme that was very multi-stakeholder, involved a lot of representatives from the forestry, indigenous communities. And this has been, it's been a constant evolution and learning. And probably it's not been so visible to those outside of the trust fund committees, how much the learning by doing has gone into improving and changing the architecture, the very light touch architecture, if you like. I mean, it's really not, we're not talking about a big wall here. Maybe I shouldn't mention walls, but you know, we're talking about something that's very flexible but durable, because it builds on the existing architecture of the MDBs. I mean, I think, as you know, the CIFs were designed by MDBs for MDBs. And I don't think that's something we should feel embarrassed about, because at the end of the day, we have billions. I mean, we are spending billions every year. Now, everything, I left the UK government, I joined the IDB for 2 years to help establish the bank as an implementing entity of the CIFs. And the response I got, what do you mean? You want us to work, public and private sector work together? You want us to work with the IFC, with the World Bank? I mean, it was like, are you serious? Are you joking? And I was like, no, well, look, this is serious money. You know, for Mexico, I designed the Mexico Renewable Energy Program. People were telling me, you are crazy. Mexico will never do renewables. CFE, the utility, it dominates. It will never allow renewables in. It's a, you know, traditional monopoly. There was some legislative change. There was interest. The Hacienda, the Ministry of Finance, saw a significant amount of money on the table, 120 million of funding for renewable energy and other energy efficiency. And they said, okay, great, let's give it a try. And so we used the concessional money for investments and some very small TC money to address some of the policy, regulatory, and what I like to call political economy challenges. I mean, many people have probably heard me say this before, but I'll say it again for those that haven't. We had a very small grant fund to support what was a very nascent wind energy lobby, a wind energy lobby group in Mexico that was, I think, half a person. And we supported them to increase their capacity, to start to develop studies so they could go and lobby Congress to say, look, wind energy is a viable solution here. That was about shifting the political economy alongside the investments, alongside supporting the regulator. So I think, you know, it's important to recognize that a lot of what's happened through the CIFs has been an evolution. It has been an evolving architecture. The question is, of course, what's coming next, and you know, where do we go? But I think, and I'll stop now because I can see the way you're holding the mic, that you're conscious of time. But it is really important that we build on the successes, the experiences, and very, very importantly, the incentives that the CIFs have set, both inside the MDBs, with governments, with the private sector, because it really is about ensuring the incentives are all working in the right direction.
Excellent, thank you. No, and I mean, you stress very clearly, we talked about challenges here, but of course a lot of things have really worked. Things take time, you have to learn. It's about changing mentality, it's changing the way we are operating, collaborating, and so on. So it is complicated. And of course, if we are looking at the future now, we are also talking about how we have to link climate finance much more to sustainability, all these other issues and so on moving forward. We talked about that a lot in the opening panel. We have about 10 minutes left. So I would like to talk a little bit about the future. I mean, tomorrow we'll be focusing a lot on the future in the sessions. So having now a completely new landscape, price is going down, we have commitments, we see transitions in many countries that were reluctant before. A lot of things are happening now. So if we want to make sure that things are moving even faster, even easier to scale up, what do we need to change? I know this is a tough question, but if you can give one or two things from your experiences, what would need to change here? Let's start. Anyone who wants to start this time? I don't want to go in the same order every time. Or you want to say something first, maybe?
Thank you, Johan. Like I previously said, we have two main challenges. That is the financing gaps and then fragmentation. But then also, going forward, we would want that we ensure adequate and predictable source of finance. Also, we would also want there to be improved coordination between the various fund managers. Yes. And then the standards and the requirements for proposal writings must also be harmonized a bit. We don't say all of them must be the same, but at least they must all at least come onto the same wavelength and be harmonized so that you don't spend more time in trying to assess the various funds. Yes. And then finally, I know that is a bit sort of a debatable issue, but we in Ghana will still want there to be fewer institutions.
Okay. Good. That's four very clear proposals. So fewer institutions to make, to streamline the system, predictability, and yeah, there are many points, Paddy, that I think goes back to what you said. So if I can take you first, maybe respond to that, to what you want to add. Yeah. Do you recognize this as a challenge?
Absolutely. Very much support what has already been said. But also what I want to, and I'll add a couple of more things, but before that, let me point out one thing which is very obvious. 10 years ago when CIF was founded, a very different world to where we are today. The solutions that are available, the cost at which those solutions are available, the greater understanding around climate change needs, all of this supports us. So we need to build on the momentum that itself can provide, working with everything that we have learned and making sure we don't throw away what we have learned works. The last piece, Minister just added, or offered 4. I'll add the 5th one. Private sector has shown what it can deliver. Private sector has got vast, 10 times more resources than clearly what you have, because you're already multiplying it by 10. And in fact, I believe private sector these things can be multiplied by 20 times. Provided you understand the needs of the private sector and work more directly with the private sector. I think there is perhaps coming less and less a need to channel through the government and government-related entities, but work much more directly to use the government-related entities to govern, to set policies, and to micro-monitor, not micromanage. Allow private sector to get on with what it can do best.
Do you think there will be an increasing shift towards private sector investments? rather than, or so, I mean, is it more as a catalyzer then that...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, I think you can rely, and private sector is moving on. I mean, as the cost comes so low, where we can become so confident that the default rate is going to be very low because it is so cost efficient, there will be more and more private sector money that is flowing in, because there is a lot of private sector money that's out there that doesn't know what to do, where to go. So it will end up there. Marshalling public sector funding in the right way, you can catalyze it and you can accelerate it. And what is needed for that 1.5 goal is to get it done next week, not next year.
Ambassador Dalba, looking at the future also, maybe picking up a little bit though, because I mean, I think also private sector funding will flow faster. I mean, there is no question that they see investment opportunities here. Sometimes a risk though, that certain countries are left out, they tend to go maybe to certain countries. The UN is always very much concerned about the most vulnerable countries also, and also coming up then to the climate summit. So looking ahead, looking at the future, what are your dimensions here? How do we make sure that actually it becomes an inclusive agenda still?
Well, I think the first point is to recognize that private and public money can grow and substantially, and we need to encourage that, but without leaving anybody behind. And we cannot continue to finance only large infrastructure projects. We need to be certain that depending on the level of development of the country, in some cases scale is not going to be so important, but the capacity to replicate projects could be also very important. In some cases we need to work regionally or sub-regionally so that the scale would be appropriate for the financing. So I think the responsibility of the UN is precisely that, to scale up public finance, to shift the policies, governments to support private investment, and investment to move away from the so-called brown economy and to put more money on the green economy, bring in more climate into development as a whole. That kind of trends in terms of policy could be encouraged by the UN, but I will insist with a balanced approach, because the needs of different countries, depending on the level of development, and different regions in some cases, because they face different challenges, is quite important for us.
Maybe just as a curiosity, and it's a broader question, the summit that we will have in September, what kind of specific outcome can we expect? Is it in terms of a declaration? Is it in terms of, are you looking for clear commitments? What is it that you'd like to see coming out of the summit?
Well, we have a big advantage, and the advantage is that we do not need a declaration. We do not need a negotiated outcome.
Yippee.
We will certainly have some kind of record and summary under the responsibility of the Secretary General. And precisely because of that, we are aiming at results, action-oriented results, commitments. Let me give you just one example. Getting a group of countries to commit to issue bonds, green bonds, or having the Chinese committing to greening the Belt and the Road Initiative, or having a number of private and public investors, funds ready to abandon investment on carbon, coal. These kind of actions are the ones we are looking for. Bold, and I would say inclusive, in the sense of addressing all needs, and especially something that, and I would put the emphasis, that we could be able to do the follow-up. We need to make everybody accountable of any commitment they undertake. Most of the summits, most of the meetings at that level at the United Nations have not had a follow-up. No. This time we will do a follow-up.
Interesting. We look really much forward to that. Can I see how many will actually miss a political declaration, an additional one? Can you raise your hand?
Raise your hand.
Oh, okay, that's good. So you can report back to the Secretary General that he has our full support for an action-oriented agenda, no additional political declarations.
The name of the summit has changed already to now it is the Climate Action Summit.
The Climate Action Summit. We love that. Thank you so much for that. Kate, talking about the future then. I mean, again, you are with an important government when it comes to the architecture. And you had some clear views about some of the challenges there. Really looking ahead, what is it that you're going to push? What are you going to drive in terms of improving the system? What would you like to see there?
So I think one of the biggest challenges, and people have been talking about this, is access to the finance that is out there. And I think that's absolutely critical, and that's on a number of fronts. I mean, that's partly joining up the conversation between public and private that we've already mentioned here. And our experience when we've worked with some countries to do that is that people are talking a different language and they talk past each other. So I think there's a lot of work to be done to kind of join up the conversations to actually help different sides of that conversation understand each other if we really are to help people access the finance that's there, and to make certainly some of the systems and the procedures simpler and more flexible, but also faster. And I don't think that access is a means. I think actually it is an end in itself. Actually raising the capacity of people to access finance is worth investing in of its own accord. And I think that's something that we probably haven't given enough time to collectively, and that we should think about much more, because I think that could be transformational. I do think we also need to build on what works. And we've heard a huge amount today about what works, and there's a huge amount in the SIFs that is working. So we mustn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, as we sometimes say. And I think that's also the basis for conversations that have been going on in the SIFs, and particularly in CTF, and a concept that we've called CTF2. How can we take what we know works, building on the evaluation, building on the experience of everyone involved in this, to actually then take it to the next level? So you're not sticking it still and keeping it in a box and not letting it evolve, but how can you take the good elements and how can you build on those and transform it, and actually then tap into the markets and use the finance that we've got there. I think the third challenge is probably for all of us just to think differently. It's very hard when you're in one paradigm to think about doing things differently, to think about, well, what could this look like and how could it look different and what might that be? And, you know, I think we've all got to challenge each other on that. Maybe we need to do more on the big sectors, which are big emitters. Can we sort of work differently with industry on some of these challenges? Can we tap into some of the actors, the players, the people in the system that we haven't yet reached? And I won't go back to my beer analogy. You're fine. And then I think that the big challenge for all of us is actually then beyond that, beyond what we often talk about, climate finance. It's the bit in the Paris Agreement, 2.1c, for those of you who love knowing which paragraph we're talking about. But it's the bit that says all flows of finance need to be compatible. It's not just climate finance. It's not just the dedicated funds that we're talking about here. It's everything. If we're going to get that absolute seismic shift that we all know needs to happen, we're not talking about the little incremental changes. We're not talking about tweaks to business as usual. We are talking to a radical change. And I think that's the bit where the architecture can provide that framework, can provide the path, if you like, for everyone else to follow.
Thank you very much. That was really very, very nice. Amal-Lee, I don't want to put pressure on you, but you are the last speaker here
I've got
today.
three minutes.
But you have also, as you said, an interesting background. You work both in governments and now in the bank, and that gives you the insights on both sides, so to say. So from your perspective, you were part of building this up. We should not throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are many things working. We need to scale up. We need to be more agile, as is the popular word today. Mm-hmm. What do you see as the future?
Well, I'll go back to the point I made at the end of my last intervention about incentives and how the framework that exists, the architecture, if we want to call it that, is creating those incentives. Now, and going back to the point that Kate just made about Paris alignment, so we, MDBs, we've announced a joint MDB approach towards Paris alignment based on 6 building blocks, which is about low carbon transformation and resiliency. It's providing innovative financial solutions, as well as policy support, and about aligning our own institutions. But at the end of the day, when we look at where we are now, I mean, our commitment that we made, we took it to governors for doubling our climate finance by 2020, which means 30% of our portfolio. And actually, in the conversation with our board, we had 3 board discussions before it got to governors. And that commitment is subject to continued access to concessional finance. Now, there was no number put on that because, you know, we had a lot of discussion that, now, of course, now in the case of Mexico, where now we've worked a lot in the wind sector, the solar sector, we probably won't use concessional money much more to do projects, wind and solar projects. But actually, we may need it to do the refinancing, to bring in the capital markets, to enable more finance to flow, recycle that finance, which is what we're doing now. In fact, with CTF and also with the UK Sustainable Infrastructure Programme. And so, you know, we have to keep innovating. And a lot of, when I talk about incentives, it's incentives for our teams. They have, if anything that's new, they have to be prepared to go into battle with our credit risk teams, particularly on the private sector side. You know, they have to educate the people who are saying, no, that's too risky. So they have to feel sufficiently that the rewards will, you know, deliver, you know, that amount of work, involved time, the opportunity costs are really worth it. And so I do, you know, feel that what the CIFs have been very good at doing have been incentivizing, partly because of the scale of resource, partly because through a programmatic approach, it was recognized that you needed to demonstrate the transformational impact, and that really required looking at the institutional context as well as the investment context. That really created a lot of very positive incentives, and those absolutely have to continue. If we are to go from 30% to 40% to 50% to, by 2050, net zero emissions, we need to be, pretty much 100% aligned to the Paris Agreement. So, you know, we have to recognize that's the journey we're all on, and the incentives, the architecture needs to create those incentives for all of us to move in that direction.
Just a quick follow-up question. I mean, you still talk, or we still talk about climate finance, but obviously, listening into today, what the panel is saying, what we said this morning, it is, you know, climate finance supporting sustainable development also. So it's much broader. We're not building energy because we want to, you know, building solar power because we want to save the climate only. We want to provide electricity and so on. So when you say 30%, how is that just shifting within the development banks?
So I mean, as a development bank, everything we do is about socio-economic development benefits. It's how to ensure that all of that is low carbon and increasingly climate resilient now. So a lot of the discussions with the board was about educating them, because when they first heard about that we wanted this 30%, they were like, oh, so then you're going to take away from other things in health, education, in, you know, in other, you know, we're not going to be able to do transportation. I was like, no. And in fact, actually, most of what we do in health and education is build hospitals and schools. Actually, we refer to that as social infrastructure. So what we've done in the last 2 or 3 years now, pretty much every school, every hospital is now a green building. Exactly. It's energy efficient, it's got solar panels, etc. So it's not about saying we're taking money away from other development objectives and putting it into climate, quite the opposite. It's about delivering low carbon, climate resilient development and building that path and working to transform all sectors of the economy ultimately. Excellent. So it actually takes us probably, hopefully soon, where we talk about 100% of our finance is actually building the society, and thus it's also climate smart. I will not summarize this panel. I think you have, you know, provided a really nice bridge from the discussions today, which has focused quite a lot on the challenges, some opportunities, of course, as well, from this morning as well, and then taking us also tomorrow when we will look into the future even more. So a big applaud, a big thank you to the panel for this. This is the end of day one, almost at least. Or do you want to have an additional panel? We can always set one up for you. It's no problem. If you don't want that, there will be a reception tonight. It's actually open for everyone. You can see it here this evening at the Hotel Berber Palace, 7 p.m. All are welcome to join us there.
Tomorrow we start at 9. There has been some different times, but we start at 9 a.m. I think buses leave at 8, if I recall correctly. I'm looking at someone who's nodding. 8. So see you tonight and enjoy. And remember that story about climate architecture and beer, and try to tell it to someone tonight and see if you remember it. Thank you very much.